You can barely tell jokes anymore. I want to be free to use the N-word. Nap. I need a nap. That's right. I said it. I'm tired of this cancel culture tomfoolery and I just want to lay down and take a nap. If you don't like it, cancel me.
The term cancel culture is a highly weaponized term.
We need to give people a place to redeem themselves, at least.
Why does everybody think that real politics takes place in cultural institutions and cultural debates? You can't resolve the climate crisis with language politics, yeah?
No one wants to read a review of an art exhibition that they haven't seen.
Where does calling out someone and where does it end, and where does cancelling someone begin?
There's a new trend, there's a new visual trend every year or so, and then there's a new theoretical trend. And maybe the way to do this is to just be trend resistant.
Hello and welcome to Standard Time, our talk show exploring a wide array of European matters and why Europe matters. I'm your host, Zsófi Papp, and on Display Europe you can watch this show or listen to it in a podcast format. Even the expression cancel culture is a very charged one. Addressing it is already tricky business. Pippa Norris, a professor at Harvard University, makes an important distinction when it comes to cancel culture. Pippa says one group may support it, believing it will level the playing field for marginalized communities. In contrast, the second group argues that cancel culture is harmful because it stifles free speech and hinders open debate. Of course, the term cancel culture itself contains a strong judgment and a negative one. Those opposed to the liberated use of racial slurs or genocidal ideology rarely call themselves cancelers. It's a mock terminology from the start. Interestingly, those who criticize woke activists and complain most about cancel culture would also refuse to label themselves with this even when they are literally banning children's books. Fun fact, also mock terminology that have come to characterize eras, Baroque and Rococo. But don't just believe me, let's look it up in the dictionary. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, cancel culture refers to the removal of support for individuals and their work, or for a group of people, an organization or a company and their work, due to an opinion or action on their part deemed objectionable to the parties calling them out. The current discourse is a rephrasing of the earlier debate on political correctness. But while PC mostly intended to regulate the speech of politicians and media workers, this time around the online audience had a greater say due to social media. And the concept is strongly anchored in television, where cancelling had long meant that somebody's TV show would be taken off of the air or out of production. And if you review TV history, public outrage has more often resulted in the cancelling of programs that challenge norms and taboos from the progressive side than for being, say, racist or misogynist. Otherwise, most American sitcoms from the 90s and 2000s wouldn't have existed, am I right?
That's what she said. Ha.
In fact, the regulation of free speech is pretty much the home terrain of conservatives. The infamous Hays Code, officially called the Motion Picture Production Code, forbade any positive depiction of homosexuals or, preferably, any depiction of homosexuals on film, calling them sex perverts. It is also the source of the twin bed paradox. Any hint of sexual activity, even between married couples, was strictly forbidden under this set of industry guidelines for the self-censorship of content, which was applied to most motion pictures and TV content released by major studios in the United States from 1934 to 1968. Hence, married couples were depicted as sleeping in separate beds. It never outlawed blackface or hateful language about disabled people, though, and it took decades to dismantle. The experience of this centralized censorship lives strongly in the memory of creative industries and journalists, and the self-identified free speech absolutists are referring to an era when dropping a lighter curse word on stage in a club could land a stand-up comic in jail. In the 1960s, for instance, moral outrage was instrumentalized by conservative Christians, and progressives were doing activism to demand more inclusive programming and against offensive stereotypes. If you want to know more about the Hays Code and American TV history, I warmly recommend the videos of Matt Baum, one of my absolute favorite YouTubers, who does well-researched, informative, and very entertaining biographies of queer artists, histories of trailblazing motion pictures, from Some Like It Hot to The Little Shop of Horrors, and American TV history. His hilariously titled book, Hi Honey, I'm Homo, is a review of queer TV history in the US, and it's a hoot. But let's get back to today. Because social media has transformed the way, time, and place these interactions occur. The term cancel culture is believed to have originated from the slang term cancel, which referred to breaking up with someone and was used in a 1980s song title, Your Love is Cancelled. Oh boy, that relationship didn't go well. It was picked up in a film and television, eventually evolving and gaining widespread popularity on social media. By 2015, the idea of canceling had become prevalent in Black Twitter, often describing a personal choice, either serious or humorous, to withdraw support from a person or work. This caused an uproar among mainstream entertainers and politicians who feel that audience pressure is encroaching on their freedoms. This was spearheaded by Donald Trump, who's literally banning all protests on university campuses and deporting people to mega prisons without any charges or process, but he still feels that censoring is affecting him. And at the other end of this continuum are people who are subjected to excessive online bullying or professional penalties without the protection of a greater fortune or a huge public platform. See, we're trying to talk about this phenomenon in a nuanced manner, with an emphasis on trying. I wouldn't go that far, but would say let's start with the positive aspect of cancel culture. Lisa Nakamura, a professor at the University of Michigan, describes cancel culture as a cultural boycott and says it provides a culture of accountability. One example of this is the Heineken ad scandal. In 2018, Heineken launched an advertisement for their light beer with the tagline, "Lighter is better," which faced widespread criticism for being racist. The ad showed a beer sliding past multiple darker-skinned individuals before stopping in front of a lighter-skinned person. Following the backlash, the company removed the ad and issued an apology. Meredith Clark, an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, says that cancel culture can give power to the disenfranchised voices. Osita Dvanevu, a staff writer for The New Republic, argues that the fear of cancel culture stems from the rise of a new group, young progressives, minorities, and women who have gained influence and are actively shaping discussions on justice and social norms. A good example of that would be the #MeToo movement in 2017, when individuals started to come forward with their own allegations and experiences of sexual assault. This movement started in Hollywood, when actresses started to speak out against powerful film producer Harvey Weinstein, which led to his downfall. LeVar Burton and Sonny Hostin have suggested renaming cancel culture as consequence culture, emphasizing that individuals who express opinions or make public statements and have a huge platform should be accountable for their impact on others. It literally is a delicate question that needs a lot of care and attention on a case-by-case basis to decide how and why certain restrictions are applied to a speaker. I should know, I'm from a region where we say buzz instead of saying hello, and it took me quite some accommodating when I moved away to deal with the fragile hearts of my new neighbors. I'm personally not a fan of blanket restrictions or censorship, but I also believe in the responsibility and the rights of an editor and a publisher who gets to decide which positions and opinions to platform. Shout out to the absolute boss journal editors who refuse to track changes in an edited document. That's the ultimate power move. Last summer, I was at an editors gathering where the mention of this practice exploded the room. About 50 people who had politely and respectfully debated for 3 days suddenly started to shout and exclaim with the excitement of a lottery winner. We never settled on a position, and I'd love to have another 3 days to talk about just this matter with my peers. You know, power to the people who correct your typos. Yet the bigger your platform is, the more responsibility it comes with, including representation of opinions and positions different from your own, especially when we see major platforms actively creating feedback loops and information bubbles that isolate their audiences from certain viewpoints, or preemptively censor all content on certain topics, like Facebook and Instagram do with everything concerning Palestine these days. Now, instead of launching a crusade against an imaginary foe, we want to look into the delicacies of this problem. How should institutions restrict their employees from certain opinions? Who's responsible for a measured debate and who gets to vent their opinions unchecked? And is it possible to cancel a writer who nobody reads anyway? Today we talk about cancel culture in relation to cinema and art universities. We decided to sit down with three humans to elaborate on the fear of being cancelled, what role art universities should play in this phenomenon, and if anyone still actually reads critics. Born in Hanover in 1976, Johan Hartle studied philosophy and political science. After completing his doctorate, he researched and taught in Amsterdam, Jerusalem, Karlsruhe, and Rome, among other places, and he has been the rector of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna since 2019. Maja Vouk is a freelance writer and cultural manager from Vienna. As a true cinephile, she regularly attends and works for various European film festivals. And Max L. Feldman is a writer based in Vienna. He currently teaches at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and at the University of Arts in Linz. And today we are hosted by the Library of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. A big thank you to them. Very welcome. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us and talk about, well, we're going to decide what we term, whether we want to use the term cancel culture, deplatforming, or something completely different that I haven't heard of. Is very deliberately a hub that is inclusive and pays a lot of attention to the benchmarks that make this inclusion happen. Are you the Vogue police? How does that work? How does an academic institution, which tends to be a very slow-moving, inert, huge institution, transform this way?
We have quite high standards of inclusiveness and of anti-discriminatory standards, etc. And that makes us, of course, in many situations a target for rightist politics. So we get all kinds of parliamentary requests from right-wing parties. That's the one side. On the other hand, there's a highly politicized debate here as well, which also touches upon frontiers of what one might want to discuss or what one might not want to discuss in these terms. Also because I think we are in a situation of transformation where liberal standards and standards of freedom of speech are heavily debated and have also changed throughout time. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in.
Standards of discourse, what's tolerable, what's supposed to be given a platform, are really moving in opposite directions on different ends of the political spectrum. So what progressives would expect, what liberals in the classical sense would expect, and what the right wing would expect are like three edges of a triangle and don't seem to have a huge overlap.
Since you brought it up, the term cancel culture is a highly weaponized term, that's quite clear. But in fact, there are canceling practices from all sides of the political spectrum. And that makes it quite complicated to actually operate with this term and to understand what's going on. The freedom of speech movement originally was part of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s and clearly part of an anti-racist conjuncture and development, whereas indeed the left has also contributed to certain logics of deplatforming and scandalizing types of discourse, thereby also weakening certain liberal standards that we nowadays might want to have.
Maja, you specialize in the field where the terminology cancel culture comes from, and that's film and specifically TV. How do you see this discourse specifically in the film field? Because it has gotten very toxic at some point.
Cancel culture does have its positive sides, that it actually indicates issues and societal problems, but it does not give us any there's no change following. There have been examples. I'm not going to get into detail, but I'm going to just mention the #MeToo movement that came from the film industry and entertainment industry that had its momentum because of this calling out, but also canceling certain people and holding them accountable. I think that's also, it's such a fine line. Where does calling out someone and where does it end, and where does canceling someone begin? Nowadays it's extremely heated and extremely binary, unfortunately, and people online especially do not see it as a discourse or as a conversation. They use it to bully people into submission and take away the platform or the power.
There seems to be a huge difference between the layers of discourse on who gets a platform, who should be deplatformed, who shouldn't be given decision-making power or power over other people. And then there's the public discourse that goes on social media that is extremely polarized. How do you see this? How does this discourse about who gets to be platformed, who gets to exhibit, represent a country or an institution even, how do you see this discourse?
Well, inside the contemporary art world, it's a world that creates its own very low-level Hollywood-like celebrity culture and is susceptible to the same kind of moral kitsch where sentimentality trumps reasoned discourse or even assessing things, individuals, works of art, whatever else on the basis of evidence and what they really are. But mercifully, I'm very much apart from this. As a critic, people think I'm the person doing the cancelling, and I have no power to cancel anyone and wouldn't. Well, within the discourse of criticism itself, there isn't much criticizing that gets done. And I would say that most critics in my position are encouraged to do very little that isn't mere description of the thing that's in front of you. Making condemnatory or moral judgments is seen as pointless and bad PR. And I've fallen foul of this myself, where I've tried to say honestly what I thought about certain things, and I was cancelled not for political or moral reasons, but for commercially inconvenient reasons. Maybe cancellation and a public relations discourse and a marketing discourse are tied up together in ways that are uncomfortable to think about.
Is this because of how art journalism is financed? Because much of art journalism is financed through art institutions now. Yes,
partially, but magazines have advertisers. And to speak anecdotally without naming any names, I wrote a scathing review of some art put on in this place, mainly about what this place is like. A place that has no commanding aesthetic and yet aestheticizes everything. And my piece was canned after 4 edits because the company, the umbrella company that owned this specific institution, or whatever you want to call it, was a big advertiser in the publication I was writing for.
A lot of financing and a lot of institutional power revolves within this circle simply because art journalism, criticism right now, it's not big business. So who's supposed to sustain it then?
I would say almost exclusively, and the art world, more than the film industry, more than other forms of media, is really very opaque. And when I try to explain to people how I get anything done and how I go to different cities to write about art, people always raise their eyebrows at the funding procedures and the way that the money flows. And I think a lot of it is, I mean, maybe I'm going to get cancelled for saying this now, right? Maybe I'm going to get cancelled for blowing the whistle on the flow from institutions down through PR companies, down through journalists, and up again through editors. But that's how the entire industry works. An industry in which no one reads art criticism. So it's unclear what it's for other than the creation of an emotional atmosphere that's glamorous and chic and maybe deep. Art's meant to be deep, but it's often not.
Look, not enough people watch this show for you to get cancelled for it, I'm afraid to say. Let's talk about the procedural, though, especially with you, Johan. You recently had a very contested example of, well, not cancelling a colleague, but...
At something like the Academy of Fine Arts is that we are sitting between various public spheres, so we could say. So there's an official public sphere that is sustained by official institutions, media institutions, the parliament, parties, etc., etc. And that kind of discourse is very differently structured to what we also have, which is an internal type of discourse within academic activist contexts that takes place in social media or via mailing lists, etc. And there's basically no more mediation between the two. Yeah. I've seen that Max has written a review on Jürgen Habermas's newer work on the structural changes of the public sphere, and that's precisely about that. So there's no integrated public sphere anymore where, you know, different types of discourse would really come together and could, you know, be confronted on the level of pure argumentation. So they've basically fallen apart. But there's one more split and one more separation in the public spheres that we are exposed to, and that is that indeed the discussion inside Austria or the Germanic post-Nazi realm, Austria, Germany on the one hand, and the international context is very, very different. So if you read Der Standard and you read Le Monde or NSC Handelsblatt or The Guardian, you get a very different type of discourse concerning the situation in the Middle East. So we have that split too, and we have that split inside our institution because we have people from all over the planet, and that's good, yeah. But it's not always easy to integrate and to make sense of this.
The specific issue that Johan has dealt with is beside the point, I think. The discourse is the thing that's actually the primary issue. And it has something to do with what I guess is moral kitsch. There's a kind of replacement of a language. Clement Greenberg described artistic kitsch as being a compensation for the destruction of folk culture by industrialization. Moral kitsch, as we see it in the current state of online digital discourse, is a compensation for the lack of a stable, secure language where these competing contested claims and counterclaims can be sufficiently judged and adjudicated. I mean, the standards for this seem to have changed dramatically. When I was young, British TV comedy was basically oriented around, or British TV culture in general was really oriented around a certain deliberate creation of low-level bullying conflict. Gordon Ramsay being a good example, Big Brother being a good example, this type of thing. And this seeped into the discourse, or just everyday comic discussion has been eradicated by these alleged new forces of woke and political correctness. And with figures like Andrew Tate has now resurfaced in an even more invidious and even more baffling way. These standards also change over time, but it's never clear exactly who's in the driving seat.
But who decides what is offensive nowadays? That's interesting. I feel like it's a bottom-up kind of social media. That's like the main platform now for anything, for discussion. The internet has become this new space for debate, or actually even not debate. That's the problem. If it were a space for debate, it would be great. But it's just an echo chamber for people who are living side by side, these parallel societies that exist. And who has the final say of claiming this is offensive? Or it's not. It's legitimate. People are confused. Everyone's confused. I'm a digital native and I'm confused. I don't even know what to say anymore. I censor myself all the time because it is unclear to me, and I don't know who is in the know of this. And I think it's a really huge problem in everyday life, not just in academia or in art discussions or in film. It's just everyday life becomes a bit more difficult because of this.
We owe a huge thank you to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna for hosting us. It's not only one of the most prestigious and historic art academies in Europe, but also impressively forward-thinking and innovative. We're honored to be filming this episode in a place where tradition meets bold creativity. But let's get back to the discussion now. There's two major translation issues here. One of them is more obvious. There's this global discourse that is driven via some of mainstream media, most of like a surface level sampling of social media that conventional media is trying to engage with, trying to stay relevant, really peddling basically a rumor mill. And a more or less global audience is consuming this, who are not even natives of that given language, let alone those registers. And then there's another translation problem, which is even deeper, that fuels, I think, some overreaction as well, is that language by its nature is very changeable. So what counted as completely normal phrasing 300 years ago is extremely offensive right now, and that's completely normal. These changes can accelerate through time. How do you translate this kind of cultural meaning that's by its nature fluid and ever-changing into a legalistic framework, which is basically witchcraft with birds, in my very basic understanding, because legal text is always trying to codify something against the very nature of the language.
I feel like people are just waiting to throw a tomato at you, you know, whenever they can. Like it's like this weird justice system online, but without a judge, without a jury, and you cannot redeem yourself ever. Like that's how I feel when I'm writing. Like, okay, one misstep, I mean, in my case, no one would care, right? I mean, not even at me, because in my case, it wouldn't really matter because I don't have that platform. But if someone really wanted to take me down for some reason, because I don't have power, wealth, or status, it would be quite easy to, you know, deplatform me. If a group of people, again, one person cannot cancel anyone on anything, that's a myth. A group of people, like this mob culture that we have now, there's just people hurling insults at you, being outraged, but to such an extent that it's really not justifiable anymore. And that's very unhealthy, and I think creates an environment of fear, not just in writing, but in any other form of expression, especially if people are on the internet, and I'm trying myself to navigate and still be courageous to speak what I think and what I believe, and being as aware of my language as humanly possible, you know, and that's like, there's a willingness at least, and there should be a willingness to learn, and there should be opportunities to learn as well. That sounds all very utopic, but you know, there is no solution in sight right now, because we've reached a saturation point of an amalgamation of just energy on the internet, and it's just exploding everywhere and causing destruction.
But there is also something going on that I think is important. Why does everybody think that real politics takes place in cultural institutions and cultural debates? Even if we, the Academy of Fine Arts, would do everything right, and we hardly can, the world would still be wrong. Yeah, but you know, this strong emphasis on, you know, symbolic politics in cultural contexts and language politics, etc. Something has changed here as well, and I'm actually worried about this. Not so much because I'm against the claims that come with it and the intentions and intuitions. Yeah, I mean, I'm for all kinds of egalitarian projects. Yeah, that's not the thing, not the issue. But it can turn into something strangely compensatory for politics not being better outside. Yeah, when I was going to the Manifesta in Palermo a couple of years back, I thought, oh wow, this is a great human rights project, this is a great human rights project, etc. And at some point I wondered, shouldn't this actually be taking place somewhere else? Should really the arts stand in for all the things that are no longer taking place somewhere outside where they actually belong? And isn't this actually a real problem, because people get to these, you know, the good doers go to these manifesta and think, oh, world is in order because, you know, all these human rights issues are symbolically resolved in the art world. They're not resolved, they're real problems. And this comes strangely with a strongly activist impulse to also dismantle, you know, classical, procedural, legal standards in institutions. And this clearly comes from the right. We see this, you know, from authoritarian regimes all over the place. But the left has contributed to that. Yeah? So there are certain activist, anti-procedural, anti-institutional, anti-legalistic approaches that make it much, much harder to actually do our proper democratic jobs in these situations.
How could we draw a more helpful line between the role of academic institutions, for instance, or cultural institutions, and their obligation to answer to politics?
I still think that we can observe that a certain focus on symbolic politics, on language politics, etc., has, you know, this focus has increased, and I think it comes with its own pitfalls. I'm not saying it's wrong, and I understand that in many, many fields of politics, certainly all the fields of politics that we identify with identity politics, you know, legitimate claims, all important. This has its merits, but you can't resolve the climate crisis with language politics. Yeah? Neither can you resolve the climate crisis, just to name one, by occupying a certain art gallery. Yeah? You can do it. I mean, maybe it helps, and maybe it brings a certain moment of political collective pleasure that enhances the movement, whatever. But still, there should be other targets too if you really want to change situations. And I think this is also to some extent an outcome of a disintegration of the public sphere, where you have, bubbles, you have culture bubbles, and you have all kinds of bubbles that are not really in dialogue anymore with other contexts. And I see this as a really problematic issue.
For me, it's kind of reminiscent of like late medieval, early Renaissance patronage systems. You're stuck in your circle. They are going to make certain demands and allow you a certain type of freedom. You may, connect these bubbles somehow, but the majority of society is not really involved, except now they are a closer spectator, but I don't really think they have a big say, do they?
One thing there definitely is, how much is this related? We're going to find out. There's not just a lack of understanding in the wider public about how language and symbolic politics aren't going to do anything. There's also a lack of understanding of the things that are demonized. That could even be average, ordinary, conservative positions, especially on art. This is why I teach my students T.S. Eliot's great essay, Tradition on the Individual Talent, for example, because it's one of the most culturally conservative positions you could take about the value of classical culture. But in order to understand where we're coming from, and if an activist wants to be an activist, you still have to position yourself in a historical sense. So why not understand these things instead of simply writing them off? There's a lot of judgment that goes on before a judgment.
I was reminded of this question that our writer Daniela brought up earlier, and about how we deal with classics, because there are classics in a lot of fields that we now view as very problematic. From Pablo Picasso to Roman Polanski, just to name a few sex predators, proven ones. How does an informed, benevolent spectator who is not working in the arts field engage with their works and engage what we know about the artist? So is it like a Roland Barthes type of, the writer is dead, the author is dead, the artist is dead, we don't care, we only focus on the art? Do we completely throw Matisse out the window? Or is there some kind of a middle ground for a critique, for an institution, for a writer to negotiate these lines?
Let's compare Roman Polanski with someone who's been in the news recently, which is Sean Diddy Combs, formerly known as P. Diddy, formerly known as Puff Daddy. There's a great deal of difference between the quality of these two men's work. The thing that connects them is that they have both been accused of sexual crimes of various kinds, some of them deeply grotesque and morally troubling. With Polanski, the quality and the visual power and the dramatic power of his work demands us to look at it for what it is and attempt to ask this question. With Sean Diddy Combs, his work has significantly less dramatic power and less musical power and less visual power. And that separation becomes much less easy to do, because you can start drawing just connections between what's sleazy in the song and what's sleazy about him. File under Michael Jackson, though he's an entertainer rather than a powerful artist. So Alphonse Mucha being someone we all know from these magnificent Art Nouveau adverts for chocolate and biscuits and champagne or whatever, the greatest artist that we know by style but not by name. To say that he was cancelled by the incoming communists after 1948 in Czechoslovakia is to kind of downplay the level of social repression and censorship that went on. However, since 1963, no one has been able to see his insane 20-piece epic canvas, the Slav epic, that tells the history, an idealized history of the Slavs from pre-ancient times to the apotheosis of the Slavs in the universal future of universal brotherhood. That's an example of cancel culture. It's also an example of this thing you're talking about, national canons, that he was attempting to do some deep, serious, patriotic work.
Something that you probably engaged with already is the recent outcry around the film Emilia Pérez and the cancellation or supposed cancellation, disinvitation of the lead actor because of old tweets.
What we just discussed is also the kind of very old question of, can we separate art from the artist? Which has not been answered. I mean, some people answered yes, some people answered no. So there's that. We have to accept that people don't accept that an artist and their artwork can be separated. I would say that in the case of Emilia Perez and Carla Sofia Gascon, that there was a hyper-focus, and that it's like the typical and best example of cancel culture is in this case because she was lauded and praised for her work and has been nominated for an Academy Award as a first trans person. And then immediately as these tweets resurfaced, like overnight, instantly, she was a persona non grata at all the award, not all, but most award shows and festivals, which is really quick from going to you're great to you don't matter anymore and we're not going to listen to you. And given that these tweets are very old and that someone wanted them to resurface because someone digged for them, just shows that it's an extremely toxic environment because no one asked her, what about now? We're just focusing on something that is in the past, but we cancel her out, that we don't even let her to have a platform anymore. She cannot even voice her opinion, and she has apologized publicly, which the director of the movie has not done. We need to give people a place to redeem themselves, at least. Where are these tweets now? They're deleted. So people have to believe that this is true as well. I've never seen them myself. I wouldn't be able to even comment on them because they're deleted. How can I comment on that even?
In a weird and very bitter sense, this is a genuinely female experience as well. Of course, that of all trans people, but also the extreme scrutiny that comes with a different position, belonging to any minority or basically anyone but cis male. That's a huge part of this.
Yeah, which doesn't mean that you cannot criticize women or trans people, or if there's a critique to be made as well. But it's again, we have to make a difference between canceling someone and disinviting them and taking away everything that they could have in potential future jobs. That is very extreme and very radical way to deal with such situations. There's no dialogue. It's just hate. And where does this bring us? More hate. I mean, she's probably never gonna speak up again about anything because, I mean, as soon as you apologize, people are hurling slurs at her.
But of course, the amount of power and wealth you have accumulated by the time this happens to you seems to do a whole lot of difference. But let's come back to our philosopher for a second to talk still about canon, because ultimately art is about us being afraid of dying and wanting people to remember us. When we talk about canon, institutions like yours play an extremely valuable role or weighty role on codifying over time who we will ultimately remember, who we showcase now, who we put on a platform now, who comes through your institution and thus practically has a piece of paper saying that they are an artist.
Of course, we have very many applicants that don't get in, so we are exclusive in that respect. Very many people who would like to study arts at our school don't make it in the end. And the questions of exclusiveness are questions that we debate, that are highly debated at our school. I wouldn't overestimate our role in canonizing contemporary art though, because we to a certain extent attribute the title of being an artist to people who studied here and people who teach here, etc. But there are other schools that work much more in line with contemporary trends on the art market and have a much clearer policy of hiring and employing big shots, big names. And I appreciate that. These are good schools, but we have a different approach. Of course, we are dealing with canonized art. We are also teaching certain forms of art history, of course. But I think the general standard, the general agreement on the necessity to decanonize is very, very high at the Academy. I would even say I might want to debate this because I find it important also to have role models to go against, and to also be aware of certain institutional measures that have written a history of relevance. You can then still contest it, but it is at least the starting point for debate and for Oedipal kind of conflicts.
In my line of work, we like to say money likes to go where money already exists. That's why we have professors with 6 tenures in parallel at different institutions, which could have hired 5 other people who would be there for the job, except they wanted to have the same person for 2 weeks a year. So Maja, is there something where you see like a point of intervention, for instance, in the film world?
I feel like these bigger institutions that award films and that have the power to decide, to make these decisions, because the criticism usually comes from the people or from smaller, literally smaller actors in the industry. It's the bigger institutions that have to make a stance and who are unfortunately afraid, because critics can write as much as they want if no one is reading it, and no one is reading critics. Really, no one is. They're reading maybe the caption, if at all. People with larger platforms, unfortunately in this industry, need to speak up and need to demand a diversified view and need to ask for a debate, or at least engage in conversation. They just make decisions, I don't know, based on money, based on monetary interests. And this is a very sad and very frustrating development in the industry.
No one wants to read a review of an art exhibition that they haven't seen, especially when there are minimal pictures or none at all. It's just unrealistic. You can write as clearly or as beautifully as you like, but that's not going to engage anybody. So the tactic to make an intervention is to connect something that has highly contemporary relevance to much broader set of cultural trends, leaning into historical trajectories and writing about things that are interesting. Art is also it's a discourse dominated by its own jargon, dominated by the most recent academic buzzwords, popularized and then kind of boulderized and then massaged into new meanings. And there's a new trend, there's a new visual trend every year or so, and then there's a new theoretical trend. And maybe the way to do this is to just be trend resistant.
Yeah, and if somebody wants a good entry point, Max has recently written on rugby. And I would argue that's the same kind of art criticism that you exercise there. Is it the Dublin Review of Books?
It is a Dublin Review of Books. Viewers are more than welcome to read this. To say it's about rugby would not wouldn't even be true, right? It's just I went to see a rugby match in provincial Ireland, and then I wrote about what it's like to be there at the time. It's about culture and it's about what it means to be in a place and to feel stuff, which is what art criticism should be about.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you especially, Johan, for having us here at the Academy today. Now we want to know what you think. Who should be allowed to use their platform and who should be allowed to police them? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and while you're already rummaging down there, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. This show is powered by Display Europe, a platform for multilingual content on European politics and culture, and this project is co-funded by the EU and the European Cultural Foundation. Importantly, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers and authors only. They do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACEA can be held responsible for them.